My name is Ethan Ilzetzki. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Economics here at LSE. It is a pleasure to have all of you here, see all of you here, but particularly a pleasure to host David Pilling. David is the FT Africa editor, and he was previously the Asia editor for the FT. He has also been reported from Latin America, so truly a global citizen, can give perspectives from pretty much any place in the world. And he is going to be talking today about his book, The Growth Delusion, which is a very interesting and extremely entertainingly written book on the question of economic growth and how it is measured. So that sounds like a very wonky topic, but David makes it much more interesting than I can make it sound. David will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then have time for questions and answers. Do we have a hashtag for this event, or?
It's LSE Pilling, I think.
It's LSE Pilling. Okay, so hashtag LSE
First
Pilling.
time I've ever had a hashtag.
Okay. So yeah, feel free, but as you are doing that, do that with a muted phone. So please now take the opportunity to mute your phones. This event is being recorded, and ringing phones might make it impossible for us to provide a podcast of the event, but we'll make our best effort to do so. So you can re-listen to this event afterwards. So I think with no further ado, David Pilling.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to talk about GDP for the next 40 minutes. So if any of you want to leave, now's the time. I'm at the LSE, and so I thought that I really had to bring some charts. So there are, quite a few charts to get through. I want to start with the composition of British GDP. So let's start with chart number 1. Now, in 2012, two statisticians working for the Organisation for National Statistics received an instruction. The instruction was they were to start counting sex workers. The reason was that Eurostat, which was trying to set standards across Europe for how we measure GDP, it wanted to standardize this. One of the reasons it wanted to standardize it was because, for example, prostitution was legal in some European countries and therefore was counted in GDP. Likewise, some types of drugs, they weren't in others. So we weren't comparing like with like, and this was important for the European Union because it wanted a standardized measure so that it could then charge different countries their quota measured as a percentage of GDP. So there was a rationality for this. So Abramsky and Drew, being statisticians, being told to go and count the number of sex workers in Britain, did what came naturally, and they began to look at some academic papers. There's a paper that there was a paper that said that there was a certain number of female prostitutes, and bizarrely, GDP in Britain only counts female sex workers. It does not count male sex workers, which is a beginning of my kind of story about the certain arbitrary nature of GDP. So there was this study that showed the number of on-street and off-street sex workers in London. They then extrapolated that for the country at large. The report was out of date, and so they worked out how much the male population had grown, and then they extrapolated again. And they came up with a number, sort of fiendishly exact number, that there were 60,879 sex workers working in Britain. And they then had to work out how much they charged. So they started scanning the internet. And they went to various websites. One was called punter.net, and I'm not making this up. And they came up with, again, an alarmingly exact figure that sexual services, on average, cost £67.16. And I have this unfortunate image of the punter counting out the last pennies, 13, 14, 15. They then multiplied this by the number of services that they calculated happened per week, which was 25, and came up with a number. Now, that number actually wouldn't tell you what the GDP of sex work was, because GDP is not just the value of everything produced, it is the value added. The important thing to know, and many of you will know this, if you think of a loaf of bread that costs, say, £3, you cannot count just that £3 as going towards GDP, because you've already counted the flour in that bread, and you've already counted the wheat in that flour. So you have to take these things off at each stage, the inputs, the intermediate inputs. And so Abramsky and Drew had to do this. So they took off various things, lighting, rent. They took off something called rubber items. This was never explained what it was. I was left in some doubt as to whether they were talking about condoms or some kind of sexy boots or something. But anyway, this came off. And they came up with it. They then did the same, by the way, for drugs. So they heroin, crack cocaine, powder cocaine, amphetamines, ecstasy, and cannabis. So if your drug of choice is not on that list, I'm afraid you're not doing your part for the British economy. They came up with a number, £9.7 billion, and that was the number in 2014 that these activities contributed to GDP. Now, I tell this rather odd story for two reasons. One is to explain that there is not a computer in the sky that works out every transaction that happens. We work out our GDP through surveys, through gathering bits of data, and through kind of extrapolating. And the ONS does that extremely well and extremely professionally, and so do many organizations around the world. Of course, the less money a country has, the less it's able to do that. But you have to remember that there isn't something out there called GDP that we measure. It's something that we kind of guesstimate. And the second is the certain sort of arbitrary nature. We think of this as a sacrosanct measure, and yet, for example, America doesn't count crime. We count crime. It counts guns, but it doesn't count certain types of activities, like, for example, heroin. And yet, we do take this measure extraordinarily seriously. People talk about the economy. Politicians would very rarely stand up and say, I'm actually going to shrink the economy, but in recompense, you'll get A, B, C, and D. That's almost unthinkable. And yet, the economy that we're talking about is measured by this strange thing called GDP. Just to show you, GDP is often used as a denominator. So we measure things like debt against GDP, tax against GDP. This is the only bit of the book I'm going to read out, and it's not written by me. So it was a letter to the Financial Times. And this letter we received when there was a debate in Britain about whether defense spending should drop below 2% of GDP, which is what we'd always spent. I imagine this letter, I can't actually remember who it's from, but I imagine that it was written by a sort of retired colonel from Sussex or something. And he says, Major General Whittington Smith, I think he's called. And he said, Sir, the 2% of GDP NATO benchmark to which you refer in your editorial is surely a very strange way in which to calculate the country's defence budget. Applying this criterion to the UK has meant that the targeted expenditure figure has recently risen as a result of prostitutes' earnings and the consumption of illegal drugs being included in the composition of GDP, which seems mildly ridiculous. If only prostitutes worked a little bit harder, the army could have a few more guns. The idea of an economy and of growth is something that we almost take for granted, and yet actually it's very modern. It's a very modern concept. For thousands of years, There really wasn't any such thing as growth. We lived in agricultural economies, and growth was more or less determined by the weather. If it rained a lot and the harvest was good, your economy grew. From about 1000 AD, China and India had by far the biggest economies in the world, though nobody thought in that way. And that stayed pretty much the same until the middle of the 17th century and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. One of the first people to have a kind of crack at looking at an economy in the way that we think about it was a guy called William Petty, who was a Surgeon General for Oliver Cromwell. He went to Ireland when Cromwell conquered Ireland, and basically he kind of divvied up Ireland, working out what the land was and how much income that could generate, because Cromwell wanted to pay the people who had financed the campaign. So this was one of the first attempts. But really, to get anything like what we have today, you have to fast forward to the 1930s, 1933, when FDR became president of America. And of course, this was in the wake of the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression. And FDR wanted to know what had happened to the economy. But there was really no way of knowing. They used to look at things like freight car loadings, what the stock market was doing, unemployment. But there was no kind of overall figure. So he asked this guy, Simon Kuznets, who has a fascinating history. But they asked Simon Kuznets to look into this. So Kuznets had a team of about 5 or 6 people. He went all over the country asking businesses and households and people questions about what they bought, what they produced, about the inputs to that production, you remember. And then in 1934, he came out with really a revolutionary document, a document that was, in a sense, to change the world. And being an economist, he came up with a really kind of jazzy, razzmatazz title. He called it National Income, 1929 to 1932. This document, though, was phenomenal. Within it, he had discovered that the US economy had halved in size in the 3 years after the Wall Street crash. And this gave FDR the kind of intellectual ammunition to begin to really ramp up the New Deal and to spend to get the economy going again. But even at this early stage, Kuznets had huge doubts about his own invention. First of all, he said, you shouldn't look at the headline figure, you need to delve much more deeply. Then he said, you should never confuse this number with well-being, something that I think that we have more or less ignored. He also wanted to take things away from GDP. We think of the economy as this natural thing, but where you kind of draw the boundaries of what is the economy and what isn't is not necessarily natural. He wanted to take away armaments because he thought armaments were a sort of defensive expenditure. He wanted to take away roads that brought workers to their factories because he saw that as an intermediate input, like flour in bread, something that helped production but that wasn't production himself. He wanted to take away financial speculation. He actually wanted to take away advertising because he thought, and you might think this is patronizing, but he thought advertising kind of woke sort of irrational desires for things and consumption, and that this was also kind of useless. Kuznets lost this battle. He lost it partly because the next time GDP really came into its own was during the war, in the run-up to the war and when the Americans entered the war. And they really wanted to know what armaments they could produce, and how that would affect the rest of the economy. And discounting armaments, discounting government expenditure, which was something else Kuznets wanted to do, would have been impossible. Keynes, who was very important in this debate, wrote a paper called How to Pay for the War. And so GDP sort of became solidified around this measure. Now, the important word in gross domestic product, the really important word, is gross. Nothing is really taken away. So we measure everything. We measure good things and we measure bad things. We measure pollution, and then if we clear up that pollution, we measure it again. We also measure plastic, for example. Plastic's become a big theme in Britain at the moment. The more plastic we pump out into the oceans for our children's children to clean up, the more that counts towards GDP. So we have to kind of think, what are we measuring and why, which is actually something that Kuznets said. One of the things we don't measure is housework. Now, we do measure some things that aren't transacted. We measure rent, for example, imputed rent. So if you live in your own house, we come up with a number of what rent you would pay if you were paying. We also measure government services, which aren't necessarily charged for. But we don't measure housework. And if we don't measure something, I guess it's my contention is that it's very easy to then devalue it, or not value it at all. And of course, housework has mainly historically been done by women. And when women move into the workforce, you know, the gender pay gap is a big issue at the moment. If women's work is not valued at all, it's valued at zero at home, then it's not surprising that as women move into the workforce, that their work is devalued. There's I'd like to kind of try a thought experiment. There's something called womenomics in Japan. Shinzo Abe brought in womenomics, and he was trying to get the economy going again. And what he noticed was that the female participation rate in the workforce in Japan was lower than in a lot of Western countries. So they began to kind of push women into the workforce. Now, opening up the workforce for women to work is obviously a very progressive thing to do, but it's still worth a sort of a thought experiment. If you imagine Japanese women, many of whom traditionally have kind of looked after children and also looked after their in-laws, if you imagine them in their home doing that and then move them next door, now, and do this throughout Japan. So everybody in Japan has moved. There is no more work or less work being done. But suddenly your GDP has gone up because those people are charging a wage to work next door. And of course your tax base has gone up. But nothing in the real world has really changed, except Grandpa has no idea the person who's looking after him. That thought experiment, I think, just again sort of shows you that we're drawing these reasonably arbitrary borders between what is part of the economy and what isn't. Breast milk is another sort of example of this. Breast milk, of course, is valued at zero, whereas powder milk, employs people, companies pay tax. If you're a politician, your kind of almost invisible incentive leans towards the milk powder company and leans against this kind of wonderful thing that women have. If every child were fed breast milk in the first hour of birth, 1/5 of child mortality in the world would cease. And yet you can see how policies can be influenced by the fact that we value this at zero. There was an Australian academic who did some work on this, tried to come up with numbers. She worked out various numbers for various economies, including America, and she worked out that breast milk was worth $53 billion to the American economy. Whose growth? We know that the American economy has been growing for years. We also know that that wages in real terms, median wages in real terms, have been stagnant since the 1970s. Inequality distribution is not something that GDP on its own, even GDP per capita, tells us about. Aggregates are dangerous, and averages are also dangerous. There's an economist joke. Being an economist joke is not very funny, but it goes, Bill Gates walks into a bar. Everyone, on average, you see, I even fluffed it. On average, everyone in the room is a billionaire. Averages are misleading. GDP is a kind of measure of more. You could divide banks, and people do, into cloakroom banks and casino banks. Cloakroom banks, you take your money, you put it in, and then you take it out some years later. Casino banks, the banks that Matt Taibbi famously said about Goldman Sachs, a great vampire squid clutching the face of wrapped around the face of humanity, I think he said. You could see banks, as Kuznets wanted, as an input. One of the main purposes of banks is to allocate capital. So let's say you have 3 widget companies. So one of the jobs of a bank is to decide which widget company is the best widget company. And society benefits because it bets on the best widget company, it lets the worst widget company go out of business, and we all benefit from much better widgets or whatever those widgets happen to be and the knock-on effects. So why count the allocation itself? Isn't that an input? And indeed, we used not to count banking very seriously in GDP. It used to be a tiny fraction of GDP. But in modern times, and partly because of the way we now calculate banking activity, banking's proportion of GDP has soared. The 2008 crash, just before the 2008 crash, just when banks were at their most dangerous, they were worth 10% of GDP. And in fact, once they were nationalized in Britain and huge state money was put into them, their value went up again. The reason is because a lot of banking activity is not charged through fees. The way that banks are traditionally measured in GDP is to take the spread between what banks borrow at and what they lend at. And the bigger that spread, i.e. the riskier the loans that they're making, the more the contribution to GDP. But you can see where that leads us. And I would argue that that led us, in a sense, to the 2008 financial crash. Now, I'm not saying if we'd have measured it differently, everything would have been fine, but I think it's worth thinking about. GDP is really bad at measuring haircuts. And that's important because haircuts, services, are 80% of our economies, modern advanced economies. GDP is very good at measuring. It's a child of the manufacturing age. It's excellent at things that you can drop on your foot: steel, concrete, chairs, bottles. But very bad at things like a haircut. How do you value these two haircuts? Maybe this salon was beautifully perfumed, beautifully decorated. There was some fantastic banter. This was a short back and sides, took 2 minutes. Well, you could say, well, you value it by the cost. This one's cheap, that one's expensive. But what happens next year? And because the only way we can come up with a sensible number for GDP is to deflate it, is to come up with some sensible number for inflation in that sector. But how do we know what the inflation was? If the price has doubled, is that because the service is twice as good? How would we possibly compare a haircut in New York with a haircut in Beijing? As I say, a lot of our economies now, psychoanalysis sessions, symphony orchestras, the only way within GDP of improving a symphony orchestra is to get the orchestra to play at twice the speed. So you can see that GDP is not particularly good at services, and yet we live in service economies. This becomes particularly true in the internet age. We think of our growth measures and the economy, as taking into account innovation. That must be what it does very well. But actually, GDP is terrible at innovation. Take an antibiotic. 200 years ago, any billionaire alive would have paid half his fortune or her fortune for a course of antibiotics if it would have saved their life. Now antibiotics cost pennies. So the same thing, even though it's obviously contributes to our life hugely, is worth nothing or very little in GDP terms. Imagine someone lugging around the Encyclopedia Britannica 20 years ago. A lot of human knowledge, they chopped down all those trees, they printed stuff, they drove it around, they sold some people the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, almost everybody on planet Earth, anybody with access to a computer at any time, has access to most of human knowledge for no charge. And the contribution to GDP? 0. GDP is not very good at measuring the informal economy. That's pretty bad news in much of the developing world because a lot of economic activity takes place outside the formal taxed economy. Even in the rich world, in 1987, Italians woke up one day, thrilled that their economy was suddenly grown 14% and was bigger than Britain's economy. Why? Because they began to measure some of the grey economy. In other words, they began to capture the mafia. As a result, Italy surpassed Britain, and the Italians celebrated this as il sorpasso, the great overtaking. A slightly different story, and really not to do with the informal economy, but one day in Nigeria, the head of national statistics held a press conference to say that GDP of Nigeria was 89% bigger than previously thought. That was because they'd changed the way it was calculated. This had a big impact. Investors started talking about Nigeria more seriously now, the biggest economy in Africa. Nigeria could borrow more because its debt to GDP ratio had gone down. We take this figure very seriously, and yet there is an arbitrary element to it. For some countries, it's easier to measure GDP from space. This is North and South Korea at night. These are the night lights. South Korea ablaze with lights. Kim Jong-un, I'm not sure what he's watching there in Pyongyang, but there's sort of one TV on. The same exercise has been done in various countries in India, and I looked at it, and there's an account of it in the book, in Kenya. There they found that, in fact, according to satellite imagery, and satellites are passing over the Earth, much, much more regularly than people with clipboards can go and ask questions in the wilds of Kenya. And it discovered that, the official statistics were exaggerating the GDP of Nairobi, the capital, and downplaying the GDP of all sorts of communities around. So if we can measure, in some economies, GDP better from space than we can on the ground, I just think, we need to think about that. I've given you a quick run through of some of the problems with GDP. I'd now like to kind of talk about how we might think of things a little bit differently. So I'll tell you the story of Bill and Ben. Bill's a banker. He earns £500,000 a year. He's a very poorly paid banker, but bear with me. Ben is a gardener, earns £25,000 a year. Who is richer? Well, Bill obviously is 20 times richer. Now, what I've just told you is the GDP of Bill and Ben, in a sense. I've told you the income, because GDP is a measure of flow. It's a measure of the income in any given year. I haven't told you anything about the wealth of these two. And I may have forgotten to mention that Ben inherited from his great aunt a great estate that was worth £100 million only last year. And he works in the garden on Saturday afternoons, for which he pays himself a nominal salary of £25,000. He's 20 and he's going to move into London next year. He's going to buy a modest place in Mayfair, and with the remaining £95 million, he'll invest that and he'll live off the interest. Bill has an unfortunate cocaine habit. This has really put a dent in his bank account. He's also a bit washed up as a banker, to be honest. He's 53. The bank's moving to Frankfurt next year, Brexit. And so he's out of a job. He's got a scratched up Porsche, but he's got a lot of payments on that. Now I've told you a little bit about the wealth of Bill and Ben. The same applies to countries. If you take a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, pumping out oil, very high GDP per capita, but you need to look at what wealth it has. If it just pumps out all that oil and doesn't replace it with anything, doesn't think about the future, doesn't diversify its economy, then very soon it's going to be the kind of Bill the Banker of nations. People have tried to measure wealth, and it's not always easy, especially when you come to things like natural capital. A guy called Robert Costanza in 1997 published a paper in Nature where he worked out that nature was worth $33 trillion. And the way he went through this was very sort of strange. I certainly won't go through it now, but he, on one side, he had what he called biomes, wetlands, forests, sea. On the other, he had the services that those things provided or didn't provide, whether they be nitrates or food production, cultural services even. And he worked out proxies for this and came up with this number, $33 trillion. Now, this really was very controversial. It really annoyed economists who kind of thought this was, if this was a back-of-the-envelope calculation, then it was really to malign envelopes. And environmentalists thought that this was nonsense. How do you value the sea? How do you value rainforest? But it was the kind of beginnings of people looking at this and trying to come up with measurements for natural wealth, produced capital, which is basically infrastructure, financial capital, which is much easier to measure because it's kind of debt, liabilities, and assets, and of course human capital. The World Bank, funnily enough, this week has come out with a very, very comprehensive report on the wealth of nations, the comprehensive wealth of nations, where it's had really quite a credible go, I would say, at measuring the wealth of 141 nations under all these categories for 20 years. And it's really worth looking at that report. For example, with a human capital, it tries to work out the lifetime earnings of everybody on the planet. It gives you a value for that in today's money, and then comes up with a total wealth figure. The wealth figure for 2014 was something like $1,140 trillion, I think. Something like 15 times the GDP of that year. And you can think of wealth like, a kind of like a bank account for which you live off, but you need to keep replenishing that bank account. So you can live off the interest, but you can't take out too much money at any given time. You have to keep the stock of that wealth, you have to keep it at its current levels. We've sort of fetishized the economy to a certain extent, and yet here it was only really invented in its modern form in the 1930s. The word economy in its modern usage only began to be used in political manifestos in the 1950s. Before that, economy meant to save money in the kind of Jane Austen use of the word. It's only really since the 1950s that politicians have begun to use this word. In the last Tory party manifesto, they used the word economy in its modern meaning 59 times. We've become a little bit kind of bamboozled with this idea, I think, of the economy, something that we can't damage, we mustn't do bad things to, as though we're not kind of part of the economy and we're not part of the equation. The reason for this sort of slightly odd cat here was I was reading about valuing nature and putting value on things, and there was this wonderful article in The Guardian where they came up with a measure. They said, why don't we use the measure CAT? A CAT apparently is an old American measure that was it was the amount of poison you needed to kill a kilo of cat, which I thought was wonderful. And it's actually my proposal that we measure GDP in cats, if only so I can write the headline in the FT that last quarter Britain's GDP grew by a whisker. This is another sort of attempt to work out the wealth of the nation or of the planet in this term, on this occasion. It's an organization called the Global Footprint Network, and it calculated, and one can quibble with its methodology, but it calculated that on the 2nd of August 2017, we'd basically used up planet Earth for that year, and from then on we were borrowing from the future. Now, we can definitely argue about what that means and about the methodology of that, but I think we can't argue with the fact that we are straining our planet. You don't have to be Thomas Malthus to think that some things are sort of reaching their limit. One looks at climate change, one looks at the acidification of the oceans, one just looks at the shrinking of the natural world. Yuval Noah Harari comes up with this amazing figure. So if you weighed all humans, there's 100 million tons of humans. You weigh what he called our enslaved animals, the pigs, the cows, the sheep that we eat, that's another 700 million tons. But you weigh all the wild animals on Earth. Whales, elephants, giraffes, rhinos, penguins, porcupines, wolves, they only weigh 100 million tons. So, our work is almost done. There really is not much left. I love this experiment. This is many of you will know this experiment, but two capuchin monkeys were put side by side, and they were both fed cucumbers. And they were fed when they performed a certain task, which was to hand over a little pebble. Both of them were as happy as Larry. Then they began to give one of the capuchin monkeys grapes, much tastier, sweeter. The capuchin monkey that was not receiving the grapes, that was still getting the cucumbers, went completely ballistic, got very upset almost immediately, started throwing the cucumbers at the handler. The reason I bring up this story is that there is a lot of research that tells us that happiness is not correlated very well after a certain level of income with growing income. Our happiness tends to be correlated with relative income. So if a certain proportion of the population is doing very well and we feel left behind, we'll suddenly feel very miserable. Lots of work has been done on this subject, on trying to measure a sense of well-being and happiness. Here at the LSE, Richard Layard, of course, very, very famously, he talks about this kind of race for status where people are at a football match and they're all sat down, and then one person stands, and then you have to stand to see over that person, and everybody stands. Suddenly everyone's standing, they've all got exactly the same view of the football match, only they have the discomfort of standing. Now, to a certain extent, this kind of crazy race we have, you can see how we are sort of compelled forwards as individuals, but you can also see the sort of madness in that. I like to think of GDP, the genius of GDP really is that it compacts all of human activity into one single number. And it is an astonishing achievement. But I sort of conceive of it of putting a very large frog into a very small matchbox. There are other sort of images, metaphors for GDP. Imagine the dashboard of a car. You may have a speedometer that tells you how fast you're going, and you may have another dial that tells you how much petrol is left in your tank. Those are two different numbers, but you cannot combine those numbers and come up with anything very meaningful. Imagine that in the cockpit of an aircraft where you have altitude and many other things. One of the things we've done with GDP is we've combined everything into one number. And one of the things I'm asking for is not to ditch GDP, but also to be aware that we can disaggregate some of those numbers. Now, GDP was one of the great inventions of the 20th century. If you don't like the idea of dismantling one of the great inventions of the 20th century, why not think about it like this? Why not think about it like releasing this frog from the matchbox? This is my last slide. There was an economist, Richard Golding, I think something of an eccentric, but he came up with this idea of the cowboy economy and the spaceman economy. The cowboy economy was really when there were few people and abundant natural resources. And the sort of objective, the rational goal was to extract as much as you possibly could, to produce as much as you possibly could, to maximize throughput. If you were a cowboy and you ruined a particular area, you chopped down all the trees or you killed all the buffalo or whatever, you'd come back in a few years' time. Even if you did, you might not need to, and everything would be kind of restored. Now we live, I would say, in a spaceman economy where the idea may not be to maximize throughput. The idea may even be to minimize throughput. That doesn't mean not to grow, but it means to think, I think, about growth in a different way, to think about quality, to think about better, not necessarily to think about more, to think about other goals, whether they be mental health, contentment, maybe more equality, if equality is what's making us all unhappy. I think that, we're stuck with this kind of cowboy measure. We're stuck with a lasso, and we're trying to measure outer space with a lasso. I'm not suggesting for one moment that we ditch GDP. I'm really asking for, I guess, three things. One is that we approach it with a certain amount of caution, cynicism even, that when people say the economy is growing 3%, we kind of begin to think, yeah, but, you know, what's hidden there? Maybe go and look for that ourselves, maybe think about that, maybe think that maybe we're being bamboozled. The second is, yes, maybe to think about some other measures to go alongside GDP. Now, this is difficult. You can't have too many measures, or you just get completely kind of overwhelmed. But you might be able to have 3 or 4 different measures. You might be able to think of some measure of distribution, or perhaps median household income. You might be able to think about some measure of wealth, or about natural capital. Maybe that's just to give CO2 emissions more political weight. Maybe that is just not to withdraw from the Paris climate change treaty. Maybe there's a measure of well-being that we could think about, a kind of a GDP plus or a GDP minus, a kind of net domestic product. There are different ways that we can think about this. Some of these measures already exist but are not kind of given the political backing. Some of them are sort of hidden from view and are being experimented on, and maybe, you know, could be given, as I say, more, you know, more exposure. And some of them may be works in progress, like the World Bank's Wealth Report, that we need to kind of put more money, resources, and thinking in. Because what we measure in the end will be what we get. And my final plea, the third plea, is just when we talk about the economy and not damaging the economy and thinking about the economy, let's remember that the economy isn't this precious set of pipes and this machinery that somehow is outside of us, that we need to be dead careful. If we need to chop down all those trees, if we need to put a pipeline through Alaska, then so be it. We are part of the economy is part of us. And we may decide to build that pipeline, we may decide to chop down those trees, but we shouldn't think that this thing is separate from us. It is part of us and we are part of it. And that is part of the message of my book. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Do you want to take questions from seated or standing?
I don't mind. So Q&A, please.
Yeah, so,
ask anything you like.
Let me just say before we begin the Q&A that David will be signing books after the talk.
You can improve my GDP, please.
Please do. Yeah, that's it. It will contribute to GDP. So all proceeds will go to GDP. So I will take questions. Are there roving mics? There are roving mics that will approach you when a question comes up. Let me remind you that questions have question marks at the end of them. So please no lectures. Yes, so there's one over here.
Hi, thank you for the great lecture. From your experience so far, could you mention a few best practices in reality that these suggestions have been taken on board? And the second question will be, how can we use these different kinds of measurements in order to arrive to fundamentally different results in the economy? For example, more equality, more affordability of, let's say, housing, for example. Then we can talk about mortgages, etc. You specifically mentioned about states and how they get loaned. Well,
okay.
Yes, you get the idea.
Let me have a go at that. And there are many, many different answers to that question, but let me just give you one. Now, I don't suggest that this measure replaces GDP at all, but there are, for instance, Maryland, and there's a chapter on Maryland and Canada in my book. They both come up with a kind of a GDP 2.0. Maryland uses something called the GPI, which is, I think, the Genuine Progress Index. And what they do is they do a bit of a Kuznets on GDP. They look at GDP and then they begin to take things away. So they have a sustainability measure. You know, if the amount of wetlands has gone down because you built a shopping mall on it, then they kind of say, well, did we repair anything else? And so they come up with a number. There's a whole methodology there, and of course it's complicated and difficult and to some extent subjective. You know, there's one kind of interesting thing they do which gives you a sort of an insight into the thinking. So they say alcohol. People buy alcohol, they must like it, that contributes to GDP. But they say, but hang on, but then there's binge drinking. We don't like binge drinking, people end up in hospital, it's antisocial. So they've gone to academic papers, a bit like Abramsky and Drew, and they've worked out how much alcohol is consumed in binge drinking, and then they take that off. Now you could say this is very kind of nanny state-ish, but it's sort of interesting. And they do this for a whole range, all published, and they come up with a number. And the number is kind of, what would we like Maryland to look like? And of course, so, that depends on who we are. What would we like Maryland to look like? And let's measure it. And of course, when you begin to measure something, that sends signals that you are likely to act on, particularly if that measure has real political backing. Now, there's something similar in Canada, and they went, in a sense, a stage further. So they asked everybody, they didn't ask everybody, but they asked a sample of people in Canada, what is it you value? What do you want? What would progress look like to you? And then they began to categorize all of this. And then they began to measure it in a kind of a parallel way. It's done at one Canadian university. So what they're doing is they're not saying, we want to become like somewhere else. For example, Scandinavia always looks really good on a lot of these alternative measures. But they're saying, we kind of like how Canada is. We just want to be a bit more like Canada. So they sort of reflect people's values back at them. They begin to measure them, whether that be work-life balance, whether it be clean air, whether it be good jobs. There's a whole kind of list, again, very published, very transparent. And the important thing there is, again, these are not numbers that a central bank can begin to set interest rates off. But they are numbers that get debates going, and they are numbers that make people kind of think, well, what is it that we want to grow for? And I think that's what Kuznets was very strong on. Our aim is not to grow. That's the means. The end is whatever it is that we want. Better health. Maybe it's more stuff. But we have various ends, and growth is the means to get to those ends. So let's decide what those ends are, and maybe begin to target those rather than targeting the intermediary. So that would be my rather rambling answer to your question.
Couple of.
Yes, hi. There have been a lot of books that have been written and that are quite critical about GDP and infinite economic growth. So like from the 70s, Limits to Growth, more recently the book by Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth, etc. Yeah. But these books have not achieved anything. I mean, politicians still rely on GDP and infinite economic growth. So why do you think that's the case? And
why do we still rely on it?
Why do you think that's the case, that these books have not achieved anything? And a bit more provocative, my second question, why do you think that your book is going to change things?
Well, I never said it was. My book is funnier than those books, so so you may get a laugh out of it. You say why has nothing changed? I would maybe disagree with that, with the premise of your question, actually, because I think to some extent things have changed. I mean, for a start, I published a few articles on GDP in the FT. They're phenomenally well read. This is a subject that, it sounds like such a boring subject, and yet people are really interested in it. Sarkozy, former French president, had a whole commission on this. You probably know, I'm sure. So Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, Fitoussi, and they came up with a report called Mismeasuring Our Lives. Sarkozy had this very interesting, I don't know if he wrote it, but there's a very interesting preface to the final book where he said that, people sense that there's a kind of a gap between what, the officials, what the experts are telling us and how our lives feel, and that gap is very dangerous and very dangerous for democracy. If you read that today, that looks quite prescient, I would say. People voted. Let's take Brexit. I mean, I think you could take you could look at this in two ways. One is that our official statistics. I mean, of course, we had a crash, and growth has been in the floor for a number of years. So you could say it's because of that. But if you take the long sweep, our economies are, double, treble, quadruple the size that they used to be. And yet clearly there are lots of communities in Britain that feel left behind, that don't feel reflected by, in those numbers. Those numbers are not telling their story. I think there's something also which is almost kind of the opposite of that. Bill Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. You get the economy growing and people will vote for you. And people are kind of saying, well, not necessarily. I mean, Brexit, people were warned that Brexit would be bad for the economy. Some people believed it, some people didn't believe it. I think it happens to be true. People voted for it anyway by a very slim margin for all sorts of good and bad reasons. But the idea that that the economy is everything, I think is being challenged somehow in the public debate, often in quite nasty ways, I have to say. This kind of backlash against Western liberalism, against globalization, against trade. But there is sort of something in the air. And if there's a nastiness in the air, well then, I would prefer to talk about it sensibly than to kind of cede ground to, really nasty interpretations of what that might mean.
There's over here, the lady right.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting and useful talk. What do you think about GDP in London now?
In where? In London?
Yes.
Well, GDP in London is clearly much above GDP in the rest of the country. So there's this huge north-south divide. I mean, I haven't really thought about GDP in London in terms of my book. The financial sector clearly was very important in kind of driving, London's economy pre-financial crash. I would argue that some of that's real. They pay, banks pay taxes. I would also argue that some of that was not what it appeared to be. We ended up bailing out some of those banks. The austerity that followed, the years of slow growth that followed, meant that some of the growth that appeared to be being propelled by the financial sector based in London was to a certain extent illusory. Those are my initial thoughts on London's GDP, but it's not something I've really looked at in great detail.
The woman here in purple.
Some countries measure happiness as an index. How could that interact with GDP as we understand it?
Well, I have a go at Bhutan. Bhutan, I think, has kind of ruined the whole happiness debate for me. I mean, some people really defend Bhutan's, approach. To me, Bhutan hasn't. It is not yet wealthy enough to begin to think about these things. If you look at, say, illiteracy rates. If you look at mortality rates, child mortality, if you look at disparity between women's literacy and male literacy, all sorts of numbers, I think, tell not a particularly happy story about Bhutan. So to me, some of the happiness thing is, well, we can't give you, development as you or I might measure it, but we can give you happiness. So I kind of think that that's slightly muddied the debate. So I was very, very skeptical about the whole happiness, about the kind of whole happiness gig, until, funny enough, I came to the LSE and looked at, and talked to people like Richard Layard and looked at some of the literature. There's something called the Cantrell Ladder questionnaire, where you ask people, and they've been doing this for years and years and years, right across Europe. You ask people to rank their own happiness on a scale of 1 to 10. So it's 0 to 10. So it's an 11 kind of rung ladder. And it's really sort of interesting. I mean, there are two interesting things, and they do this around the world. Two interesting things came out of this for me. One was that I kind of assumed that, that the income of countries might not have too much impact. So people in Nigeria might be deliriously happy. People in Sweden might be as miserable as sin. Funny enough, that's not the case. Poor countries tend to do very badly on that ranking, and wealthier countries tend to do well. But it's not a perfect correlation. So Latin American countries, Costa Rica does extremely well, for example. I think it's number 16. The French turn out to be a miserable bunch. So in other words, it tells you, or to me anyway, it tells you that there's something real there, but it does not just map GDP. And there was something other that was interesting, of which I've now entirely forgotten. Oh yes, I remember. There was a paper that the LSE put out. It's just one paper, but they mapped election results in Europe, and they mapped them against GDP growth in various countries, and then they matched them against what the happiness index was telling you. And they found that there was a better correlation between what the happiness index was telling you and the election result than, I guess this was whether the party in power stayed in or whether, the incumbent was kicked out. I can't quite remember the methodology, than GDP. So again, I began to think, well, maybe these measures are a little bit more robust than I'd imagined. I think it would be hard to set policy, but just based purely on these numbers. And I critique these numbers to some extent in the chapter on this in the book. But when you begin to think about it, Layard comes up with some really interesting policy proposals, and so do other people that have studied this, and they're sort of quite different. When you begin to think about kind of happiness maximization, you come out with different proposals. One of his, for example, is to put much more money into mental health care because they've worked out that you get a big happiness bang for your buck than trying to do other things. I think that's very interesting and very kind of useful. Again, I'm not suggesting we ditch GDP and replace it with a happiness index, but I am suggesting that maybe we think about these things a bit more seriously, and maybe even around the edges think about policies, and shaping policies around some of these other alternative numbers.
Gentleman in the back there in red.
Thanks for an interesting discussion. Thinking about the sort of environmental question and obviously some of the sort of problems, threats to continued growth and so on, I just wondered if you had any comment on things like, for instance, existence value and unpriced costs to production and growth and so on, as to whether or not they can fit in.
All of that's very weird. This was all explained to me, the value of a gorilla living in Rwanda. I've seen a gorilla I've obviously seen one in Uganda and Congo, not in Rwanda. But, I can tell you what the price of those things are. They're priceless. They're not worth £17.50 or £17 million or £17 trillion. If we destroy all our gorillas in the wild, we've done something pretty bad, I think. So I'm very worried about putting numbers on things. You begin to commoditize things and commodify them. And when you can do that, you can say, this forest is worth $20 million, but this shopping mall would bring $22 million worth of benefit. So let's cut down the forest and build a shopping mall. However, you can see why this has become, why people are thinking about this. Because if you value it at zero, which is what we basically do, then economically, the only rational thing to do is to use those things as fast as possible, to dump as many as much toxic waste into our rivers, into the sky, to chop down as many old growth forests as you possibly can as quickly as possible, to drain the oceans as quickly as possible, to dump stuff in the sea. That's perfectly economically rational because it costs nothing. So if there's no charge, so I think we have to work out ways of charging for it, whether that's, a carbon tax or a trading system. I have problems with trading systems, but if there's no monetary value attached at all, then full well what we human beings are going to do. We're going to, there was a guy, there was somebody living on Easter Island, which was an island whose entire culture depended on trees. And there was a guy who went up to the last tree and swung an axe at it and chopped it down. And he thought he was contributing to growth. And the society on his island died out. So, yeah.
In the front here.
Thanks very much. To what extent was it your involvement in Japan which caused you to focus on this subject? Because Japan seems to be a country where the GDP figures have really been pretty unimpressive, and yet, as I understand it, a lot of the basic sort of indicators of quality of life have not tracked GDP. What are the conclusions to be drawn from
Yeah,
that?
Japan definitely played a part in my thinking. I mean, I've come at this subject very much as an interested journalist, you know, asking dumb questions to very clever people, basically. And in Japan, yeah, I mean, the economy hadn't grown for 20 years in nominal terms. I remember a British politician coming to visit Japan, and we were walking down the street in Ginza, all these lights flashing, you know, I mean, this makes London look poor. You know, there was just incredible wealth all around and vibrancy. And this guy said, my God, he said, if this is a depression, I want one. You know, so, I mean, one of the reasons was, you know, we tend to look at, we were looking at nominal GDP. If you look at real GDP, Japan looks a lot better. If you look at real GDP per capita, it looks a lot better still because, of course, the Japanese population has flatlined. And after all, you know, I mean, if Donald Trump wants 3% growth, or he can have 10% growth, he just has to knock down that unbuilt wall and let in 10% more people every year. And the GDP will automatically go up. It's very easy to add to your GDP. What's hard is to add to your GDP per capita. But then there was the whole service thing. I mean, I remember reading a McKinsey report that talked about the inefficiency of Japanese services and how, you know, this was where they could really gain in GDP, was by improving their services. I looked around me, and, you know, I'd never seen better services. You know, you get on a Shinkansen train, the timetable is to a quarter of a second. You know, you stand at a little spot, the thing comes up, you get in, it whisks off at 200 miles an hour. And yet I was told that this was more inefficient than Amtrak. So I began to think, well, I mean, seriously, that's what it said in that McKinsey report. Now, I'm not saying that these guys are economists, but they're management consultants. They're kind of using economist speak. So, yeah, this did play into my thinking. You know, what's going on here? Are we really measuring like with like? Especially given that most of our modern economies are service-driven.
Hello. Where do you think reform of GDP as status quo is most likely to come from? Do you think it's most likely to come from a national government dropping out of the GDP race, or an international financial institution diffusing a new norm?
I didn't catch the beginning of it, sorry.
Where do you think reform of GDP as status quo is going to come from? Do you think it'll be a national government or an international financial institution?
I think it could be top down or bottom up. I mean, interestingly, you've got the World Bank. You can't think of a more sort of boring or austere organization. And there they are kind of worrying about GDP and what it tells you and what it doesn't tell you. And they've, you know, devoted a lot of money to a team looking into wealth accounting. But I think it will also come from people saying, oh, hang on. You know, this is not all we care about. And I sort of sense that that's there. I don't think people are ever going to give up, you know, the idea that they want to be wealthy, they want more income, they want maybe even, you know, more and more stuff. But I think people sort of are beginning to look, I mean, I suppose I wrote my book really not, you know, people will criticize it for this in a sense, although I do look at solutions, I look at different ways of measuring and how we might think about things differently. Really, I see my book as a kind of starting point for a conversation. I think, first of all, you have to kind of know what's inside the GDP sausage making factory. And once you've done that, you can almost take it where you want. You can take it in an environmental direction. You could say, well, clearly the world's got to stop growing. Or you could say, we've got to think about growth differently. Or you could say, we've got to think about local communities and, you know, or Bitcoin's the answer. Or in a sort of funny sort of sense, I don't care what you do with the material in my book. I sort of just want people to think about it a bit. And so I think it could be a top-down community, a bottom-up community, people-led, or I think it could be, you know, from the top. I mean, there are also governments making, I mean, you know, not exactly answering your question, but Norway, for example, they began to count their nature, if that's how you can put it, 100 years ago. They realized that they were chopping down all their trees. And so they began to do, you know, very sort of methodical accounting of their forestry, and their forestry is now going up. It's more of a kind of monoculture. It's not all obviously old growth forest. But then you look at that, and then you look at what they've done with their oil. And they've taken wealth out of the ground or from beneath the oceans, and they've turned a lot of that wealth into other forms of wealth, into a sovereign wealth fund, the biggest in the world, $1 trillion. They own 1% of all stocks in the world. They've left that for the next generation. What did the British do with their oil? They spent it. It's gone. So you can kind of see, if you begin to think about these things a bit more, it maybe leads to better policies.
The patient young lady over here in the third row.
Thank you. So my question ties in a little bit with your answer to the previous one. So basically you've said that GDP should not be treated as means in itself, but means to an end. But and don't you think that now we've lost sight of what the end is, and it's treated as a doctrine now, and the obsession with growth and growth for the sake of growth, and also if we did lose sight of the ends, how do we refocus, and how do we make politicians refocus on looking at what the ends are?
Will do the trick. I don't know. That's a political question, isn't it? I mean, that's people being dissatisfied. That's people. Learning to interact. I mean, my book is not an anti-expert book at all, but there is this kind of, there's this anti-expert thing in the air at the moment. I suppose what I'm saying is, we can't think of economics as this really hard to. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are studying economics. You'll know this. This is a really complicated discipline. There's all sorts of weird formulas and models that don't seem to have an awful lot to do with the economies that normal people kind of live in. What I suppose I'm trying to do, and there are many people doing this in different ways, the post-crash economic society and all that, rethinking economics and all of that, is to sort of say, economics isn't just this scientific discipline that's out there. It's political, and that means that ordinary people ought to have, ought to be au fait, ought to be able to speak to some extent the language of economics, ought to be able to debate with economists, and ought to be able to not just leave it up to the experts, but in a sense become sorts of experts themselves. So it's not a particularly great answer to your question, but it's the best I've got.
The gentleman here in the tie on the fourth row.
Thank you, David. It seems to me like the delusion is not only in the growth, it's also in GDP itself. It may be worse in its per capita calculation.
Per capita?
Per capita calculations. I mean, when you take two GDPs of equal value and growth value, and you apply them to different countries, you get different results and different interpretations. And this is something not taken care of in the literature, actually. And I can tell you that, especially that applies to developing countries, where per capita GDP means different in a country like Jordan or Tunisia or the UK or the US. And that's because of so many reasons. One of it is the social structure. It's not uncommon to see in a developing country 6 working people living under the same roof. And this has very much profound implications on their ability to save and their ability to accumulate surplus in their income. I can draw from
Can you turn it into a question very quickly?
I will.
We'd like to hear.
Well, this is a major hurdle actually for developing countries.
I understand, but we don't want to hear another lecture. We'd like to hear a question.
Well, don't you want me to introduce the issue first?
I'd like you to say one last thing that has a question mark at the end, or hand back the microphone.
No, I'll hand back.
Okay, thanks.
I agree with you. I think it's, we take this number extraordinarily seriously, and we do compare countries, and we do say, country A is doing well, country B is doing badly, but those numbers are often not comparable. The GDP per capita of Equatorial Guinea is fantastic, but the bulk of the population is living in dire poverty. Lebanon is much wealthier than it appears to be, partly because of remittances. Gross domestic product is not the same as gross national product. There are all sorts of differences. As I suggested in that slide, that where you can measure GDP reasonably well from space, some countries just don't have the capacity to measure their GDP very accurately, and yet the numbers that they come up with or that we guesstimate are taken extraordinarily seriously and determine whether a country can receive aid, at what rate it can borrow at, whether its policies are working, whether it should privatize its health system because it's clearly, a failure or whatever. So I think that we hang too much on these numbers that are not comparable. So in that sense, if that's a vague answer to your question, that's my answer.
So we'll take 2 more questions and then go by David's book.
Right. As you mentioned Richard Layard a couple of times,
yeah.
I think I remember that he tried to put a number to happiness, which is about between 50 to 60K annual income per year. So it's difficult for those who have more to achieve happiness, but it's also very difficult for those who have less to achieve 50K per year. And this social gap seems to be the issue. Is, in light of that, GDP definition academic?
Well, there's something called the Easterlin paradox, and that was one of the first kind of attempts to look at this. And that said basically precisely that happiness does track GDP, for a certain income, but then it flattens off, basically. Look, if you took those numbers very seriously, you would think much more about redistributionist policies, and that's exactly what Layard recommends. He recommends it not only for the purpose of redistribution, but also because he kind of sees us in this sort of insane rat race, that we all want to be better off than the person next door, and that this kind of leads us all to make, as he sees it, decisions that mean that we're less and less happy, or at least that could impinge upon our happiness. For instance, in order to be richer than the guy next door, we all work 16 hours a day, and therefore see less of our family, and yet we know that time spent with family is something that makes us happy. So Layard would say, well, then you have to begin to tax this kind of crazy self-incentive to go and work more. That's quite, I'm not saying I agree with that, and you could see that as very sort of paternalistic, but I think it's an interesting way, it's an alternative way at looking at how we might set policies that are not just growth maximization, economy maximization, and everything else will follow. Because basically all you're saying there is you're basically talking about trickle down, aren't you? You're saying if the whole size of the pie is bigger, if we become richer as Britain Inc. or America Inc. or Jordan Inc., then that will somehow lead to the greater well-being of all our people. Well, the answer is maybe it will and maybe it won't.
Okay, let's see. Here we go, right here, and then maybe I'll take another. You were also raising your hand, so these 2, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Thanks. I wanted to bring Piketty into the conversation because in his 2014 book, Capital in the 21st Century, he argued that growth was necessary for reducing inequality because historically the rate of return on capital being greater than growth is what had led to inequality in the first place. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that argument.
Well, I'm definitely not anti-growth, and I'm actually very pro-growth. There's a whole section of my book where I talk about poor countries. I think, I've spent a lot of my life in the developing world. I think poor countries have every right to want to catch up with Western living standards. And the way they do that is very fast growth. Very fast growth, very badly measured. That's what China has had. It's had 10% growth. It's destroyed lots of stuff. It's polluted the air. But by God, it's had growth. Probably not 10% growth, but you can see that growth. And that has had a palpable, obvious impact on people's lives. People sort of, this is where I almost kind of jump to the other side of the debate. People will say, yeah, but all that pollution is shortening people's lives. But all that growth is adding to people's lives. Chinese life expectancy has doubled since 1949, more than doubled. And this has been an extraordinary catch-up. And I'm completely on the side of China, and following it, India, and following that, Africa, to try to catch up. All I'm saying is that if we all do that and we all do it in exactly the same way, I had this figure that the planet we'd need 97 planets if we all to become as wealthy as America by the end of the century, if America's growing at 3% a year. I would say that clearly that is unsustainable. So we have to we're hitting upon some certain limits. We might have to think about growth differently. Poor countries may have to grow more intelligently, or they'll all catch up, but in the process, the planet will be destroyed. But I'm absolutely not opposed to growth or to catch up at all. And even within countries, I would, the same.
Last question.
Thank you. Yeah, it touches upon your response just to that last question. Where do you stand regarding the people who advocate, like George Monbiot and the ecologists, of a no-growth planetary agreement? There's a futurologist from Silicon Valley who spoke here last week, and one of the statistics that he threw out was that Africa alone, by 2030, will have the population greater than India and China. So if growth means the depletion of natural resources, it just stands to reason that having one planet, that we're going to reach a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the figure that he gave is wrong. Africa's population, I'm just trying to remember, it will double fairly quickly by 2050, I think, to about 2 billion. But that's 2050, and that still won't be quite as many as China and India combined. Yes, I think that 11 billion people living at American standards of living, that's going to create problems, and it's something that we urgently need to think about. Absolutely. The idea that the population is going to go on increasing forever is actually not true. It's quite likely to peak at about 11 billion at the end of this century. No growth, I'd like to see you sell that politically. I think that basically means either we all freeze and we're forever 30 times wealthier than people in Tanzania, or it means we have to all agree to half our income somehow and redistribute it. But anyway, that doesn't really work, because if you could give half your money to Tanzania, but that doesn't suddenly mean that it's got the wherewithal to continue producing that amount of income every year. You can't solve that with a magic bullet. I have sympathy with the idea and with the framework, but to me it's an unsaleable, and politically it's impossible. It doesn't mean that we don't have to think. That's why I ended with the spaceman. I think we have to think that we're living on a spaceship. This is a spaceman economy. It's not a throughput cowboy economy. But no growth? I don't think so.
Okay, so this was a fascinating discussion. To remind you, there will be book signings in the foyer just to the left of the exit. Thanks all for coming, and let's give one last LSE thanks to David Cohen.